Thank you, sir. All right, you guys can hear me okay? All right, all right. I'm Arthur Petrochenko. Here, I'll just get into the first slide. This is me. I'm a graduate of Bloomsburg University, class of 2015, which is almost 2 years ago. I was hired by Dell SecureWorks. I'm an incident response consultant. So what does that mean? I do investigations. I do forensics analysis on disk images, memory images, log data. I help clients with actually, taking the steps and procedures to handle their incident. I also do a lot of trainings. I do developments for incident response plans. So a client has, some hours with us. They want to better prepare for an incident, so they'll bring in someone like me to basically create a mock scenario. I present it to their IT team, and then I basically grade them on how well they did in their mock incident response. So those are pretty much the things that I do most. I do some other things like malware analysis, but I'm going to be honest, I'm not as great as that. But I basically do forensics is like the primary duty I do. A lot of disk analysis. I like to travel, I like nature, I like animals. Currently renovating an RV. My girlfriend's doing most of the work, not me. When I'm not sitting in front of my computer for 10 hours a day, I'm outside trying to enjoy nature. So what are we going to talk about today? So this is a lot of some people might think this is kind of some beginner information. If you're a professional, been working in IT or in IR or forensics for a long time, I'm probably going to talk about some things you already know about. Who here is a student? Dr. Riley, put your hand down. Who here is a student and they do digital forensics, computer science? Cool. Anyone who like a high school student? Hey. Anyone from a different university? Awesome. What university? Oh, cool. Okay. So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff that you probably should know if you want to go into IT in general. If you want to learn about how to do investigations, I think you should know some of this stuff. We're also going to talk about some analysis techniques. And then we're going to talk about mostly log data and all the different devices that produce these logs. So first off, I'm going to talk about forensics in general. There's three main categories of evidence. There's the disk, there's memory, and then there's log data. You'll find log data in a lot of places. So you'll find them like in a network device like firewalls, IDS, IPS, web proxies. Then there's also log data on your disk, right? Windows event logs. A lot of applications create logs. TeamViewer, LogMeIn, FTP servers create logs on a local disk. You can even find log data on memory images. Sometimes you'll be able to recover Windows event logs from memory, something a lot of people don't know about, but it's definitely possible. When we talk about forensics, it's a puzzle. You need the pieces of the puzzle. You have to understand that there are pieces and that there are pieces you might not actually have. And because of that, you might not be able to answer all the questions that you're asking. So you have to come up with an investigation plan. The first thing is, what are your goals? What questions are you asking the client? So a client comes to us, they have a problem. Hey, we want you to investigate this computer. Tell us everything that's bad on this computer. SecureWorks says, that's a bad goal. Let's refine it. What exactly do you think is happening? What do you want us to investigate? Oh, well, we see some IP address communicating to this computer. We think that there might be some intrusion. Okay, well, that's a better goal. So now we have a little bit more narrow field that we're going to investigate. So you have to come up with a goal. You have to agree on the goal, because if you don't agree on the goal and then you end up answering a question that they didn't want you to answer in the first place, then you're not really helping them out. They're spending a lot of money. You want to make sure that you're providing them what they want. So come up with an investigation plan. Ask what the goals are, and then think about it. What artifacts will help you answer those questions? If we're talking about a computer that we want to know whether or not a professor visited a bad website on a work computer, we're not necessarily going to look for malware. We're going to look at the artifacts that tell us that user's web history. So think of it like that. Investigate the artifacts that you deem are worthy for your investigation. Then find out what's in those artifacts, report on them, and then determine how likely is that artifact true. You know, there are some artifacts that might report information, but you have to kind of have you know, a judgment call where it says, it doesn't explicitly say that this artifact was created at this time, but there's some surrounding artifacts that indicate that it was created around this time. You have to provide a confidence level for those artifacts. You can't just say, this artifact was created, this file was created at this time, and we just kind of assume that. That's not good enough. You have to provide a confidence level. So we're going to be talking about log data here today, but we're also going to talk a little bit about some stuff on disk. Usually we want to get all the evidence possible. I usually only get the disk image, unfortunately. Okay, so we're going to start a little basic here. Who here knows what a Windows domain is? Can someone tell me what a Windows domain is? Preferably a student. Saw a hand. Anybody? So Bloomsburg University has a domain, right? Basically, you have users, you have a bunch of workstations. A Windows domain is basically where people will use infrastructure that IT has set up. So does anybody know what a domain controller is? What is a domain controller? Right. Right. So it manages Active Directory. So Windows domain, it runs off of Active Directory. And then there's a server called a domain controller that basically has Active Directory installed. It's a Windows server role. So your IT staff, Bloomsburg's IT staff, manually creates users for all of the students so that the students can log on to, you know, lab computers, they can access email, they can access MyHusky. So there's not a lot of Bloomsburg students here. That's kind of funny. So there's an application called MyHusky. It's basically a application that students log on to. They can manage their financial aid. They can manage their emergency contacts, their personal information. They can check out their transcript, right? So that's a web application. Who here knows what a web application is? Anyone tell me what a web application is? Someone from this side? Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm. Right. So you access it by typing in bloomu.edu/myhusky, and then you get to the application. The application. Oh, thanks for telling me that. This is not. Great. So a web application is installed on a server, right? And it's basically running and serving this web page that users can log on to. They can use this application. It's actually installed on a server. And typically, the web application is connected to a database, and that's where all the student information is actually stored. So it's something to keep in mind. But one thing to remember is that users have to log on to the web application. How do they log on? They use their bloomu.edu credentials, which is tied to Active Directory. Exchange. So who knows what an Exchange server is? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so email is essential for all businesses pretty much. The way you authenticate to it is basically using Active Directory again. You have email. You need to log in because if you don't log in, then someone, you know, anybody can use your email. So you have to have credentials to log in. Exchange is pretty much common on all domains. If you're not using Exchange, then you might use Office 365, which is kind of like Microsoft's solution to not having an on-premise server to manage email. Gmail also has a solution for businesses to manage email for their users. And then we have some network appliances here. So this is our domain. This is what we're going to be talking about today. For the most part, you don't interact with any of these things other than a workstation. You know, you type in your credentials at a lab workstation and you do your work. You have your files hosted on your profile. And then when you log on to another workstation, those files might migrate to another computer, but they're only migrating for your username. Then this stuff here, you don't really see too often, but it exists. And for investigations, you want to have an idea of what these are doing. So today we're talking about log data, right? Why are we talking about a domain? This has nothing to do with the talk. What's really important here is that you are aware that these devices exist. You are aware of what these devices do. A firewall, who knows what a firewall does? Yeah, it logs traffic going in and out of the firewall. So if you're thinking, hey, I want to know what's going on, can I see the traffic between this workstation and this workstation? Can you see the traffic between that? What would log that data? Yeah, the switch, right? So if you're thinking about, I want to see the traffic between these two workstations, you're not going to look at the firewall. You're going to have to look at NetFlow logs that come from the switch. So it's important to understand that all of this information, it doesn't just exist. There are devices, and you have to know what those devices do. And you have to see whether or not you're actually logging data with those devices. So common misconception, a client says, hey, we'll give you all of our NetFlow logs. We'll give you all of our firewall logs. Tell us what happened in our environment. And we'll say, first of all, do you have that data? Second of all, is it going to tell us what we're actually trying to investigate? Keep in mind what the goals are. And then we have a remote computer. We won't really talk about. Any questions on what a Windows domain is or what any of these are at this time? So the first thing we're going to talk about is network traffic logs. Like we mentioned before, we have a firewall here, and we have a web proxy here. They are key to a Windows domain. They're key to a network. So we have to know what they actually do. So here are the type of information that you guys will actually be able to get from a firewall. Event time, source IP address, destination IP address, the IP address of the actual device that's doing the logging, the firewall IP, which direction it's going. It won't say explicitly, but you can kind of assume based on looking at which one comes first. Whether or not the traffic was allowed or whether or not it was denied. What the interface was used and what firewall rule actually allowed that traffic or denied that traffic. So these things are pretty important to keep in mind. When you're looking at firewall logs, you can say, oh, this data went from this IP address to this IP address. Okay, but was it allowed or was it denied? Oh, it was allowed. Okay, are there any other firewalls in front of it or behind it? Yeah, okay, so we have to look at those logs as well. You have to keep in mind that just getting the information from one source, you have to be aware of what the other devices are around it. Who here knows what a web proxy is? Tell me what a web proxy is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's kind of like an intermediary between you and the internet. So when you make a web request, say if I'm going to msn.com, I'm not actually going to msn.com. I'm telling my web proxy to go to msn.com for me. The web proxy will pull down the actual page and then save a local copy of it. And then that proxy is actually supplying me the information I'm requesting. It's helpful because if you have 3,000 people on your network asking for the same web page, the web proxy only makes the request once, and then instead of having 3,000 requests being made, which can save on bandwidth. But what's also cool about a web proxy is that it can filter out websites that you shouldn't be looking at. It can filter out, say, hey, you shouldn't be going to these pornographic websites or gambling websites. And what else is that it will log, hopefully, log the data that you are, the web request that you're trying to make. So you have a little bit of visibility into what your users are trying to access. So here's an example of why this is important. If you were to use incognito mode to browse to, let's say, a gambling website, would disk forensics be able to tell you whether or not that person accessed that website? Probably not. You may, like, there might be some artifacts, but there's probably none. So that's a problem, right? Because if you're in an investigation, you're saying, hey, we need to find out whether or not this person accessed this website. And then, you say, okay, this person did not access any gambling websites. We looked at his internet history, we didn't find any. All right, how confident are you in that answer? Well, we're kind of confident. I mean, he might have used incognito mode, so we can't say for sure. Okay, well, that answer's not good enough. Well, do you have a web proxy? If you have a web proxy and they did that activity on your network, then you would have a much higher confidence of whether or not they actually did visit those gambling websites. So that's important. When you're talking about investigations where user activity is involved, internet history is involved, you want to make sure that you're also thinking about the log data that's available. So this is the some of the information you'll get from a web proxy. You get what just like a web request. So you'll get information whether or not it was actually successful. So like if it resulted with a 200 status, that means that is you were able to successfully request the data. If it resulted with like a 404, that means the website was not found. And that can be kind of interesting depending on the investigation. So one other thing is that this data, these are from like what we like kind of talk about, like refer to as dumb network devices, right? So, we talked about Active Directory before. If you have a firewall and it's basically logging source IP address and destination IP address, but it doesn't really know what the source is, like, oh, I see that this is 192.168.0.30, but I don't actually know if it's a workstation, if it's a server. You don't really have much context with it. That's what like a next generation firewall is. So if you ever heard of the term next generation firewall, it really talks about like the additional capabilities it has, the additional integration it has with Active Directory. If you think about it like this, would you rather have, would you rather have like 7 columns in an Excel spreadsheet that tell you information about what happened, or would you rather have 30 columns? It gives you much more granular, information about all the traffic. So the next generation firewall, they have a lot of great features. Active Directory integration. So you'll actually be able to have visibility into what username requested such and such data, what application was used. So firewall, who here knows what port 80443 is? Right, it's web traffic, HTTP, HTTPS, right? You just had a regular firewall that said, there is a port 80 traffic from this IP address to this IP address. You have to assume that it's web traffic. You really can't say for sure because port numbers are arbitrary. I can do torrent activity over port 80. It's whatever. You can do anything over port 80. But next gen firewalls, they do inspection. They're aware of the application. So they'll look at the port 80 traffic and tell you whether or not it's actually a web request or if it's actually, just like some hunk of data that looks weird, might be encrypted. So that's pretty important is, what kind of firewall are you using? What kind of data can you expect out of it? Yep. Well, you use for malware, like you can post data, but it's essentially a web request at that time. It's an example. Or if like you see Notepad using port 80, that's really that's really weird. Yep. What's that? So the question is if like incognito mode like obfuscates the data. That's it. Uh, we usually so like if incognito mode is used, it basically just prevents like website data from being cached locally or being stored locally. So it doesn't necessarily alter the data or the web requests. But there's malware that make web requests and use URL encoding so that if you look at the URL, it doesn't necessarily look malicious, but you can deobfuscate the URL and then you can do that. But in terms of like incognito mode, it doesn't deobfuscate or it doesn't obfuscate any actual traffic. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I personally haven't seen that. Yeah, but it's not to say that they don't exist. Yep. Yeah, I mean they can do both. It's depending on how you configure it. Ideally, you'd like it to block any like abnormal behavior. So like if you think about data being exfiltrated, right? If it's going over SSL, normally if it's just like a dumb firewall, it might not actually be able to see that traffic. You might not be able to say whether or not that was internal data leaving your environment. But with SSL decryption, you'll be able to just say, hey, this doesn't look like something we want to leave our environment, and they can kill it. That's also like kind of like a DLP, like a data loss prevention solution. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so yeah, just be aware of what your network traffic logs are. I mean, there's other devices like IDS, IPS that will provide some insight into whether or not what this traffic actually is, if it's like a SQL injection attack. There's also NetFlow data, which we're not really going to talk about today, but you're not going to be able to really have a lot of devices that will tell you network traffic within your environment. It's only what the traffic is being passed through a firewall. And typically these are at the border, so you really often don't have visibility between workstations in your environment. So that's something to keep in mind. Some things that, some tips to when investigating firewall logs. So first of all, you have to go into investigation with a goal, with a plan, right? You're not just going to look at all this firewall log data and say, hey, I see all this badness. It doesn't really work that way. What you need to do is have some context. What are you specifically looking for? Do you have an indicator? Do you have an IP address that is a part of a malware C2? Do you have some indication that there's no problem. Do you know if there's an indicator that you already are aware of that you want to search? Start there. Search for the environment for what you already know. Do you have a time frame? Search for that time frame. See what pops up there. If you just kind of go in, like say, I'm gonna look at all of your data blindly looking for badness, it doesn't really work that way. If you're talking about like data exfiltration, and you have a time frame, or if you know a IP address that you're looking to see if there's being data exfiltrated to, how much data is being sent to that IP address. If your firewall is capable of logging the amount of traffic, then you can check over like a 3-minute period how much data is actually being sent to that IP address. So those kind of strategies will help you answer your goal. What ports were observed? A workstation usually only uses a few ports. 80, 443, 25. If there's a FTP server on your workstation, or if there's like a really high port, you might want to figure out what that port is being used for. Is it for if it's torrents? You might want to look into that. And so if you find any malicious activity on the disk, or if you find any malicious activity in your firewall logs, try to correlate it with other evidence. So if you have a disk image, look at your disk and see what was going on at that time. Again, with the web proxy logs, do you have an indicator? Do you have reason to believe that, a teacher was looking at a bad website? Do you know what that website might be? Do you know what the time frame of that might be? Look for things that don't really necessarily make sense. Like when would a user need to do a put request? So a put request is basically when you're sending a file to another server. When would you actually need to upload something? It shouldn't happen too often. So if you see something like that, you can just grep for put in your web proxy logs and see what shows up. Encoded characters in your URL, so that can be kind of suspicious. It could be legitimate though. There's a lot of legitimate URLs that have encoded characters. Any web requests that fail, how often does a user go to a website that doesn't exist? I mean, it happens legitimately, but if it's malware that's trying to upload information to a URL that's no longer available because malware sites get taken down and malware C2 servers get taken down, if it's repeatedly trying to access those, those sites, you'll get a lot of failures. So, if you see a lot of failures, that's a good indication that there's something weird going on and warrants additional investigation. If you see a web request for an executable file, are you trying to download Adobe Setup? That's legitimate. But if you're trying to download a program from a domain that's hosted in Russia with an exe extension, that's pretty weird. So those are some things to kind of keep in the back of your head if you're investigating web proxy logs. So what do I use for investigating this? Not much, nothing fancy really, just a text editor. Excel is my friend. If I can put it into like a CSV format, I do. Yeah. And then if there's like some data that is not normalized, or if it's like raw data, it's not in a nice delimited fashion, you can put it maybe into like a central logging solution like Sawmill or something, and then that might be able to help you out. But typically, I just use a text editor. Okay, so network traffic logs are really good for telling you about what's going on passing through a particular device, but it doesn't really tell you a lot about what's happening inside your network, because if you don't log that kind of data, you don't really have the visibility. And again, it really depends on what your goals are for the investigation. So if you're investigating, malware and it's trying to contact the C2 server, you're going to want to look at traffic logs. But if you're concerned about like a human threat actor inside your environment trying to get to other systems, then you're not going to necessarily look at network traffic logs. You're going to look to see authentication logs. Is this username trying to access other computers in your network? So authentication logs are huge. So in our domain, if we want to RDP from one computer to another, we tempt a connection. Every connection is essentially going to be authenticating against the domain controller to, basically verify that your user credentials are correct, that this user exists, and the password that we have in our database is correct. Same goes for Exchange. If you're trying to log onto your email, or if you're setting up a connection on your phone, it's going to authenticate against the domain controller. Same thing with the MyHusky web app. If you're trying to access this web application and it's using your bloomu.edu credentials, it's going to authenticate against your domain controller. Keep these things in mind, because you might not remember that you have visibility into these authentication requests. If you think someone's account was compromised, what things can they try to break into? Well, do I have visibility into the things that they're trying to break into? Maybe. If you have enough logging for your domain controller, you might be able to have a proof that, hey, Joe Schmo was trying to log into his MyHusky account at 3 o'clock in the morning. Is that normal? Maybe. Do I have a source IP address that says that this guy was trying to log in using an IP address originating from Russia? That can help indicate. So identify what your logs tell you. And then we're also going to talk about email authentication logs a little bit later for like Office 365. Does anyone here work in an environment that has Office 365? Okay. Do you guys administer it or know the people that administer it? Have you ever tried to request authentication logs from Microsoft? Yeah? How'd that go? Did you get them? No? Did they say it wasn't enabled? Or what was the problem? They can't share it? Oh, okay. That might be a different issue then. hmm Yeah, a lot of our clients we have, they use Office 365, and then they have an incident where they say, "Hey, we need to find out whether or not someone accessed this guy's email account," and then they have no visibility because they didn't realize logging wasn't enabled in the first place. So that's something to keep in mind. Is proactively think about, do I have visibility? See what we're doing on time. Okay, great. Next, we're going to talk about Windows event logs. I mean, you could teach a whole semester on Windows event logs. There's so many of them. There's so many nuances with them. It's a well-documented format, but it is it's a binary. At least the newer ones are binary format. So they can present some challenges. They're not super easy to parse. There's a lot of parsers for them. A lot of forensic suites will help get you the information you want. So today we're going to talk about how to use a free tool to parse them really well. But Windows event logs, they provide a wealth of information. Security event logs are probably the more important ones. They basically show who logged into this computer, and keep in mind it also shows who tried to authenticate to Active Directory. So not only on your local computer is it going to show who logged on, but it's going to show who tried to log on from one computer to another. It's really important. So here's some really common event IDs that are investigated. System events, so a service is being created. This is really big. A lot of malware will create a service. A lot of tools like that hackers use, like Metasploit, they will create excuse me. They will create artifacts that that a service was created. Audit log, excuse me. So an audit log being cleared is basically someone deleting evidence in your environment. That should really not happen. IT administrators don't really do that. They really shouldn't, because the security event logs, all the event logs kind of roll over on themselves. They don't need to be cleared to free up space. So if you see that, that's pretty suspicious. Application logs, here's some events that show when an application was installed, but something to also keep in mind is that third-party applications, like I know Symantec, antivirus creates logs. There's a lot of logs that can be created by vendors that you're not aware of. So keep those things in mind. If you're talking about a case where data might have been exfiltrated, yeah, you're going to look for malware that exfiltrates data. But if they have an application like Dropbox or like a SugarSync, are there logs for those applications that say, hey, this person set up file sharing to his Dropbox account? Those kind of logs can help you determine whether or not something was done unintentionally. That was data exfiltration. That's something to keep in mind. Okay, so this is a really good resource here, ultimatewindowssecurity.com. It tells you all of the details about all the security event logs, because they can get pretty complicated. There's a lot of information in them. So what do we use for analyzing Windows event logs? Who here actually looks at event logs on a regular basis? Okay. What do you guys look at event logs for? What do you think? Yeah. Hmm. Great. That's awesome. And we're going to talk about central logging a little bit later today. Someone else, how do you guys analyze event logs if you don't have a central logging server or a SIEM? What strategies would you use to look at event logs? Hmm. Yeah, so you just open them up in like Event Viewer. Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to talk about some of the tools that are available to like get into a format that's easy to work with. So here, I think it's demo time. So I have a couple of sample Windows event logs. So we have here, these samples come from like a SANS course where there's a service created on a machine, and we were trying to identify malicious activity. Like I said before, a service is a 7D45 on the system event logs, and the security event logs show login activity. So we'll first look at the security event log. So you can just double click on it and then open it up in an event viewer, and this is typically how most people will look at the data. But if you have a very large event log, it becomes pretty cumbersome. You can scroll through it, right? You can see account was successfully logged on, log on type 3. Who knows what a log on type 3 log on is? It's often with like a network log on, like SMB, like accessing a file share. So it's pretty common. And you can see there's a lot of stuff here. This account name Vibranium logged transaction stage changed. So one of the first things you should do is filter. And this is where it comes to the point where you have to have some idea of what you're looking for. You have to be aware of what event IDs there are that will help you answer the question. So we want to know who all logged on. So let's filter event IDs. I think 46, 24 will show logons. Right, so here's all the logons, but as you can see, we still have a ton of events here. So if someone just handed me this event log and say, hey, go find badness, it's going to take a long time. Oh, so here's a logon type 10. So logon type 10 is like using RDP. That's a lot more interesting than logon type 3. It means someone actually used RDP to get a GUI access to the workstation. And so this should give us some information like the source of where this person logged in from. So this is the kind of information you want to know. When it happened, the source of the logon, who logged on. So this is good. But like I said before, it's pretty cumbersome to work with. There's a lot of fields here, and really the only way you can pull data out of it is just by copying and pasting it. So there's some tools available. There's one tool that a lot of people like called Event Log Explorer. So we open up the event log with that tool, and we have like a view here where we have columns that pretty much we can sort and filter on, which is really great. So let's see if we can go find that event again. So we'll say event ID was 4624. Right, so we have all of these logon events. We got some context down here. Source IP address. So what we could do is, we can take the source IP address and search to find all of the logs that reference this. Right, so here's all the logs that reference that. What we're interested in is logon type 10. So what we could do here is take this information, paste it in here. We want to look for logon type 10, and then you have a lot more a much easier way to access what you're looking for. So if you're interested in finding intrusion, you want to look at logon type 10, see what IP address is logged onto this computer. If there's like a foreign IP address, or which is really not typical because our you usually don't have outside connections logging directly into computers, but if you do, that's bad. So you can see all these IP addresses, they're all internal, logging on to this computer. So the cool thing about Windows event logs is that they have a whole bunch of information, but it's really hard to pull the data out of the event log. So this area right here, all this description, you can actually pull out individual fields, and that's exactly what we want to do. Is we want to be able to say, I want a column with all of these source IP addresses. I want a column with all of these logon types. So what we can do here with this tool, at least, is we can configure custom columns that basically allow us to look at the specific fields here. They're actually parameters. So we'll use a preset here. One of the presets will populate these different parameters. So it'll show you the username and the domain. Let's say if we wanted to use a parameter to see the logon type, I believe it's logon type 9. The parameter number is 9 for this specific event log ID. So if you all of these parameters are assigned basically a particular place, so you can just kind of play around and check out which parameters give you information. So the parameter 10 was user 32 here. So what we're looking for is, can we get to parameter this parameter? So I actually know which one it is. Right, so now if we're investigating an intrusion on this system, this would be very helpful to have in this view. Basically, all the IP addresses, the remote, the logon type, and then this will make our investigation a lot easier. The problem with this view is that this data is still not really accessible to us. We can't filter on it. We can't. I'm double clicking here. I'm double clicking here. You can see that it changes. It sorts it differently. But if I click here, it doesn't. If you try to copy out this data, it does it in a way that it doesn't actually export the custom fields. I'll just save it here. So we have all these descriptions here, right? There's super detailed information in one column, and in an investigation, this is helpful if you just want to like search for something in particular. Use a Control F to find. But if you want to sort and filter, it really is not helping us in terms of what we want to do. So what we're going to talk about now is a tool called Log Parser. It's actually made by Microsoft. It works on a wide variety of log formats like IIS logs and Windows event logs. So this is what we're going to use. It's a method that I work with when I'm looking at a lot of event logs from different systems. So it's a program that's a command line program, but there's also a GUI front end called Log Parser Studio. So we'll fire that up. And so what this does, it asks us to query a file. So we'll look at this security event log that we're interested in. see if I get this. So one of the things we could do real quick to just make sure it works is we can do a select. It's basically running SQL queries. We want to select everything from this log file. We got to specify the event log. So it allows us to basically select all the events and put it out into this format. It spits it out. We have some interesting things here. So some columns look pretty similar to Event Log Explorer, right? The event ID, the category. And so we see that the strings over here pretty much contains the same data that's in the description field here. So I can export this out into a CSV, which is helpful if I want to look search for strings. But what I really want to do is be able to extract all this data that's out of these these fields, all these separate parameters. I want to put them in individual columns. So what you can do with Log Parser Studio is you can basically write a query so that you're querying specific parameters inside the event log. That's what we're going to do now. So we'll say, instead of select everything, we'll say time generated. So this is a field that's already in, that's defined. So we do time generated, and then we want to do event ID column. We'll just try to run it against those. So we were able to query what we're requesting, just these two columns. So what we want to do now is see if we can pull data out of particular parameters. So what you can do that is you can use extract string or token. And then you give it a name. So we'll say string 4 is actually the SID, which is like the associated with the user. See if that's correct. So you can see the user that was associated with these IDs. So now what I'm really concerned about is, I want to find out this, the source IP addresses and the logon types for all of these events. And I'm only concerned about the event 4624. So we're going to further refine this. So we'll do the SQL query where event ID equals 4624, and we want to add another column. So we'll say processing source IP 18. ID. I'm not sure why that's not working. So what I have here is these pre-canned queries. So I basically ran through and found out which queries I want to do. So you can just, once you devise them, you can copy and paste them into Log Parser Studio, and you can run the query against an event log and output basically all of the description information in a nice column format, so that you can say, all right, here's all the logon types, here's 10, and then you can see all the source IP addresses, process name that was used for them, and the users that are associated with it. Now, this is pretty helpful, because a lot of times when you're working with event logs, it's pretty cumbersome. You don't have the data separated into specific fields. So this is really helpful. Who here works with event logs and thinks this is helpful? Yeah? Okay. This was not a waste of time. So we're going to export this as a CSV. We're going to call it 4624. So what we want to do is we want to add more information to this. So we have all of these event IDs that show us, you know, we have all these 4624 logon events, and we want to get more information around it. So one of the other things that are really interesting is service creation. So we'll go ahead and see if we can get the system event log loaded. So we'll add, basically, I created a query so that we're going to get the service creation events, and then have these null fields so that they kind of act as a space holder, so that when we add them to the CSV, the information lines up correctly. So we'll add an additional file to query system event. Run the command. So here are all the services that were created on the same box that we're investigating. You can see we have PS exec, which is, you know, kind of suspicious. Who here knows what PS exec is? Can you explain? Yeah, you can use it to push PowerShell to other computers. It can be used to push an executable to a remote system. A lot of times attackers will use it to remotely execute a tool on another computer, like a credential harvester. So we also see some other things here that are kind of interesting. So this executable here, we see F response was executed. This top LZAS. So this is good information. We're going to export this out to another CSV. We'll call it 7045. Great. And then we'll also do this event log. This is like a log off event. So when I'm working with a lot of system event logs and security event logs from multiple workstations, it can get pretty cumbersome when you're trying to use an event log explorer to, you know, basically build a timeline of all this stuff that's happened on multiple computers. So this would be useful to pull events from multiple security event logs into one view. So we'll do the same thing for the log off creations. And then, so after I have all these CSVs, one thing I would do is basically take the data that's in these and copy them all into one spreadsheet. Right. Now I have all my events in one spreadsheet, and it can make it a lot easier to identify what was going on. So I'll sort it by date. And then a couple other things I'll do is add a filter, and then make the view top so it freezes the top. And then I can start looking, you know, at what was that one, PS exec. So we see that a service was created, PS exec. Then when you look at a lot of event logs, it might not tell you, the user particularly that was used to do these activities, but then you have some, you basically build a timeline of activity that happened. So we see that this user logged in, this Vibranian user logged in, and then PS exec service was created. This one here, source host, is just like a random string of numbers. That's pretty suspicious. Let's see if I'm doing time. Okay, I'm going over. So, this is one method that I use when I'm working with a lot of system event logs. If you have any questions on that process, talk to me after this presentation. So a couple of things some other things I want to talk about is email authentication logs. So, like we said before, you want to find out what users' accounts might have been compromised. One way to identify that is by looking to see who may have accessed their email remotely. So OA, Outlook webmail. So a lot of corporations have users that are able to log into a website to access their email. Office 365 similar. One thing to keep in mind is that by default, this is not logged. So it's something you want to talk to Microsoft about. It actually, Office 365 actually uses Azure as a backbone, and Azure is basically Active Directory. So what's one thing that you want to keep in mind is, you have essentially Active Directory in the cloud, and you can request authentication logs, and they can provide a lot of useful information, like what applications were used by this user. Did they use SharePoint? Did they create files? Did they delete files in their SharePoint online? Gmail also has some authentication logs that can be useful. So when you're thinking about a lot of these incidents, you have to think about what data do I actually want to look at, because you might overlook the fact that information that you're looking for is not on the host, but it's actually in log data. So some of the incident scenarios, like we talked about, like if you had a teacher who was using their workstation for looking at malicious websites, you might not see it on disk, but if they did it on the network, then you go to the web proxy logs. And one thing about central logging, so all this data is stored on individual systems. So you got security event logs here, you got security event logs here. You might have some actual logs on the application server, depending on what the application is. You have firewall logs here, you have web proxies here. So central logging, like a Splunk or something like that, is really useful because it takes all the log data on the host and then it puts it into one central location. This is useful because it will do data analysis for you. It will look at your event logs and say, hey, there's an event log being cleared. That's suspicious. And it'll send an email to your IT staff and say, you should look at this. It will also release the burden of having all that information stored on the local host. So you don't want your domain controller to crash because you're running out of disk space. You want all that data to go somewhere else that's dedicated for that purpose. And also, if you have an attacker, or you think there's an attacker in your environment, and they're trying to delete data on the host, then you can actually have a peace of mind knowing that they won't touch the data that's on the central logging server. So here's some things to consider from my investigations. We always tell our clients, look at the logging that you currently have, what can be done better, try to improve on it. Make sure that it's actually being retained. A lot of times we talk to clients and they say, hey, we have log data, we have firewall logs that go back 3 years, and then it turns out they don't. So that's something that needs to be probably periodically checked, is make sure that your logs actually exist. Practice collecting logs. Go talk to Microsoft, see how long it would actually take for you to get log data from Microsoft. If you have a vendor that does your firewall management for you, ask them if you can get some log data and see how long that would take. All right, I went over a little bit. Are there any questions for my presentation? Yep. So we see them wiping out event logs. We see the event logs being cleared for sure. A lot of times that happens like when people use like a interpreter or Metasploit, or if they're installing point of sale malware. We've seen that happen before. In terms of like, you know, firewall logs, I don't see like firewalls themselves being compromised and the event log or the firewall logs being destroyed. We haven't seen that often. It's usually just like host logs that get, you know, wiped. Any other questions? All right, thanks.